But we are going to kick off with a look at the war in Ukraine, and in particular Ukrainian casualties. I did a little interview with TNT Radio on Friday night, which raised some of the issues, and I wanted to get back into this subject, which I regard as very important, because of course people are fighting, dying and being wounded. Here's the BBC headline, which appeared on Friday: Russia doesn't count its war dead, so we did. A particularly offensive interactive graphic from the BBC. And as far as I can see, they're gloating at the Russian deaths. But of course, the BBC are silent on Ukrainian casualties in what is NATO's proxy war. So why the silence? Well, let's have a little think about things. And this is probably the first one to bring in that body bags count from the Falklands, Iraq, Afghanistan to Vietnam. When the boys arrive home in bags, the support for the war dies. So we can be fairly sure that at the moment the West is desperate to keep the true Ukrainian casualties out of the way, because that could interfere with the conduct and the support for the war. And if I add a bit more in here, let's do this. The US, UK, NATO and the EU cannot risk rebellion in Ukraine. Ukraine has got to fight their proxy war to the last Ukrainian, and therefore the Ukrainian public must never understand the scale of slaughter of their own troops. Now, I wanted to bring evidence up on screen because I was challenged, certainly on Friday night, about evidence. Well, of course, we're reliant on what is reported. I've taken a selection of those reports, and let's work our way through and see what they have to tell us. So here's good old BBC. Ukrainian casualties, Kiev losing up to 200 troops a day, according to a Zelensky aide. But if we speed this up a bit and label it, there's between 100 and 200 killed per day. We've got the fact that Ukraine is desperate for artillery to, quote, level up the playing field with the Russians. They're being outgunned by the Russians. And then we've got another report in this article that between 100 killed and 500 injured per day. And so it goes on. We've got a report here from the 1st of July 2022. There's any estimates of anywhere between 35,500 for Ukraine, for Russian deaths by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And if we bring in the next one here, this is the Ukrainians themselves. They're making a claim back in July 2022 of 40,000 Russian dead. We've got another one here by the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Reznikov. He claims that the real Russian losses are 55,000, and that is the 21st of September 2022. If we pop Newsweek on, Ukraine anger over von der Leyen's unverified 100,000 dead soldiers claim. And this, of course, is when she spoke out publicly saying that there were 100,000 dead Ukrainian. She called them officers at the time, but it raised great consternation, and then suddenly that report disappeared. Back on the BBC, this is the 2nd of December 2022. Ukrainian war, Zelensky aide reveals up to 13,000 war dead. But of course, the interesting thing about this particular article is that we've got a statement of between 100 and 200 Ukrainian soldiers dying daily. And then we've got the US General Mark Milley saying that around 100,000 Russian and 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed since the start of the war. We're looking there at December 2022. If we move on, we've got BBC here in February this year. Russian soldier death rate highest since the first week of the war, with a claim based on Ukrainian data showing 824 Russian soldiers dying per day in February. We've got the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense effectively saying they will never get tired of counting the dead bodies. 150,000 Russian occupiers eliminated. Does that mean dead and wounded? We don't know, but there's the statement. If we go to the Kiev Independent, the claim is that Russia lost 5 times more soldiers in Bakhmut than Ukraine. If we look at the Kiev Independent again here, we've got Russian casualties on the Bakhmut front are assumed to be very high, but Ukraine is also taking heavy losses. NATO estimates that at least 5 Russian soldiers were killed for every Ukrainian loss. But then look at the key statement, and the quote is this: "It's a pity that probably 90% of our losses are from artillery or tanks and aviation." This is a comment from a Ukrainian soldier. What is significant about this is, of course, whoever has the mass of artillery produces the dead bodies on the other side, and the Russians clearly have the upper hand, as this Ukrainian soldier is saying. If we look at this report from Kiev Independent, this is June 2023, where the claim is that Russia's continuing to suffer losses. But at the end it says, or the final paragraph on screen says, a Western official recently told British Sky News that as of June the 1st, Russia had suffered over 60,000 casualties during its assault on Bakhmut. And that's a pretty big figure. If we have a look at another report in June 2023, the 10th of June by the Kiev Independent, it's claiming that Russia has lost 214,660 troops in Ukraine. And a Reuters report, 13th of June, says that Ukraine's counteroffensive has not been successful in many areas, and that the Russians were claiming that Ukrainian casualties were 10 times higher than Russia's own losses. So we go on to Associated Press here, and according to them, both sides are suffering heavy casualties in this counteroffensive. One more, and Washington Post, both sides suffer heavy casualties, but there's a quote from Prigozhin, who's saying that he recruited 50,000 convicts, and apparently 10,000 of those are dead in Bakhmut. So if we do a little bit of a summary here, and then we'll invite David to comment, but this is the picture that we can put on screen. In June 2022, 100 Ukrainian killed and 500 injured per day. 1st of July, 35,000 Russians claimed dead and 23,000 Ukrainians. In the 27th of July, 40,000 Russian dead were claimed. In September 22, 55,000 Russian dead. In November 22, 100,000 Ukrainian troops killed. And that's the figure that came out from Ursula von der Leyen in her public announcement. And we'll put at the bottom in December 22, other reports of 100 to 200 Ukrainians killed per day, plus the US General Milley talking about 100,000 Russian and 100,000 Ukrainian casualties from the start of the conflict. And if we move through into 23 March, we're trying to say that Russia has lost 5 times more soldiers in Bakhmut. 15th of March, 5 Russians lost for each Ukrainian, but 90% of the Ukrainian losses are admitted due to artillery. June 23, Russian casualties claimed by the West in Bakhmut to be 60,000. And the 10th of June, we've got this report of 214.5 roughly Russian losses, with 890 recorded on a day. June, 13th of June this year, Ukrainian casualties 10 times higher than Russia. That was the Russian claim. And the 18th of June, we've got a claim there about 10,000 Russians being killed in Bakhmut. So if we make some comment on this, and we're labeling it notes and assumptions, this is the best analysis we can produce. Ukraine has been fighting with a significant artillery, air force and long-range weapon disadvantage. It's already had to effectively replace one army with tens of thousands of young semi-trained troops. They've just had a basic few weeks training before they're thrown into the front line. Ukraine has been forced to use a mishmash of Soviet and obsolete NATO armor and other weapons. Ukraine has been forced to attack defended Russian positions with no air cover. So let's think about this. Faced with a mismatch in military capabilities, it appears highly unlikely, to me at least, that Ukrainian casualties will be at parity with Russian casualties. It's not unreasonable to assume that Ukrainian losses will be somewhere in the order of 2 to 3 times the Russians, because of the weapons and artillery mismatch. And therefore, if we take that 214,000 Russian loss figure, twice equates to 429,000 casualties, or 3 to 643, of which 1 in 5 may be assumed killed. So if we take the estimate of 40 or 55,000 Russian dead as correct, then we may also assume that 2 or 3 times that number have died on the Ukrainian side, which would bring us to 80 to 110,000, which strangely starts to tie in with the sort of the numbers that von der Leyen was mentioning. David, very, very rapid run through what is possibly happening, but critical, I think, that the Ukrainian casualties not being mentioned.
This has been one of the most noticeable things. Finding out about this has been almost impossible. If you go on the internet and you search, you get article after article on Russian casualties and almost complete silence on what's happening to the Ukrainian forces. There have been some, as you said, some estimates. US Defense Intelligence Agency in April estimated up to 223,000 total Russian casualties, of which up to 43,000 killed, 180,000 wounded. And their figures for the Ukrainians at that point were 131,000 total casualties, 17,500 killed, 113,000 wounded. So the Americans are trying to suggest that with a major imbalance in artillery and aircraft, that the result is that the Russians are taking losses at roughly 2 to 1 of the Ukrainians. Now, the attacking side normally takes higher losses, and that's mostly been the Russians. But the point you make about the prevalence of casualties due to artillery and the huge acknowledged 5 to 1 imbalance in artillery firepower in favour of the Russians, that does not seem credible. So we're faced with answers coming out of the Western capitals like Washington that don't seem to have any credibility. We've got claims coming out of Russia that don't seem to have any credibility, and this is a difficulty of forming an intelligent view as to what the truth might be, because the truth will determine the course of this war. Because if you're right about the figures here, Brian, the Ukrainians will have to be forced to bring an end to the offensive, go into a holding operation to conserve manpower, and either sensibly look for peace or simply look for a very long war of gradual grinding attrition, but on a smaller scale. It will affect what happens. If what we've been told is correct from the sort of Western side, then it's different. You would have a Ukrainian offensive, the Russians would be running out of manpower, and the whole thing would be looking quite unlike the picture we're seeing today.
Okay, David, thank you for that. And I'm just going to comment. If we ask what is Ukraine fighting, I believe Ukraine is actually fighting NATO, and of course NATO has already buried its way into the heart of Ukraine via Victoria Nuland's policies, not only on getting in amongst the whole infrastructure of Ukraine, but of course working with the Ukrainians to unleash this war on the Russians. More on that in coming news.